Alright, so before I get started, let's make one thing really, really clear. Both Zionists and anti-Semites try their damnedest to make people think that the words Israeli and Jew are synonymous, like they mean the same thing, and they don't. They never have. The majority of the world's Jews live outside of Israel, and inside of Israel, the majority of the population are Jews, yes, but there is still a significant minority of other ethno-religious groups. So Israeli and Jew do not mean the same thing. They never have. One's a nationality, one is an ethno-religious group. That said, a lot of people have referred to Israel as an apartheid state, and it is. It just is. Like, it is easily comparable to places like Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. And just like both of those places, whose regimes collapsed, by the way, the Israelis, and particularly the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are largely the kingmakers in Israeli politics, are their own worst enemy. You know, like, all they would have to do is to ease up and moderate a lot of their beliefs and a lot of their actions, and most of their problems would fall away. You know, most of the problems plaguing their country, of which there are many, would fall away. But for those unaware, ultra-Orthodox Jews are a large part of the Israeli population, and they're only growing more and more, largely because they just have an insane birth rate. Last number I saw was it was like 6.6 children per woman, which is insane. So even if they started off as a pretty small part of the population, they've just grown and grown and grown until they've become just a substantial chunk of it. And they also contribute nothing to Israeli society. Like, I mean it. They are exempt from military service, which most Israelis have to do military service. You know, like, if they don't do military service, they have to do something else where, like, they are working as firefighters or doctors or something like that, you know. And ultra-Orthodox Jews don't. They also don't have actual jobs. They just kind of study the Torah all the time, and the government just pays them money to do that, just to exist, basically. So, again, like, this is tax money being taken from other Israelis, which could be used for, like, you know, actual stuff that contributes to society. You know, schools, hospitals, roads, military funding, like, things like that that would benefit the average person in Israel, but instead it's just going to these guys who do nothing productive. But at the same time, they are a voting bloc. You know, they're a very solid voting bloc, I should say. Like, they all vote for the same people. Like, they vote for whoever their religious leaders tell them to, basically, just like most cults. And so they really can't be ignored. And so they have these super extreme beliefs as well. Like, they are, like, on the far right of Israeli politics. They are in favor of, like, illegal settlements in the West Bank. They're in favor of just straight up genociding all the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And so they vote for politicians who will support that. And these politicians, again, they can't shut off their tap of free money, which, again, these guys just vote for a living. They don't actually work for a living. It's got to be a nice setup if you can find your way into it. But the Israeli politicians can't ignore these guys. They have to do what they want. And they are, by and large, the reason that people like Netanyahu and the far right have been able to not only come to power, but dominate Israeli politics for the last couple of decades. And things like the illegal settlements in the West Bank, and the constant raids and airstrikes on Palestinians, and constant... I mean, all of Palestine is basically just occupied territory. Like, even places like Gaza, which aren't officially occupied, are still cut off on all sides by the Israeli military, and they control everything and everyone that comes in and out. So that's essentially an occupied territory. And all of this is continuing largely because that's what the far right in Israel wants. And the far right in Israel is a substantial chunk of the electorate, let's be clear. Like, just like the average white South African during apartheid was stupidly racist, the average Israeli is also stupidly racist. And we can get into how much of that is their own fault versus how much of that is just them being a product of their environment. And that, like, that's a complicated question, but that's not really the point I'm trying to make. I'm just saying, like, unfortunately, the average Israeli is stupidly racist. And there's probably ways to fix that, but I don't know what it would be right now. But my point is, this brutal military occupation, as well as just generally denying civil rights to various groups of people, that is what has caused groups like Hamas to not only appear, but to grow and continue to have influence. And that is how they've radicalized generation upon generation of Palestinians to do shit like the October 7th attacks. Like that is how you create a terrorist. Like they don't just pop up one day. And the thing is, Israel is not in any sort of position where it has to worry about being militarily defeated and wiped off the map in any way. Like once upon a time, that was a real concern for them, but it has not been the case for 5 decades at least. Like it's been a long, long time because pretty much all of its surrounding countries are just a mess, to say the least. And even the ones that aren't really just aren't militarily on the same level as the IDF. Like they're just not. Say what you will about the IDF. It's a brutal colonialist police force. Like it's not even really a military anymore, but it is very powerful militarily. Like in terms of air power, naval power, ground power, discipline among the troops, like the actual experience their officers have and everything. It just, there's no military force nearby, either run by a state or not run by a state, like militias and stuff, which could stand up against it. So Israel is really in no position where they're going to stop existing because of military force anytime soon. But the terrorists and insurgencies that they have to deal with can still cause a lot of problems. And that's what I mean when I say the Israelis are their own worst enemy. Because, like, they're the ones that are causing all of this, all of these issues, you know, all the terrorism and everything. Like, again, if they just moderated their approach a bit, then most of the justifications that Hamas and similar groups like Hamas have to justify their own existence, most of those justifications would be gone. However, the Israeli far right relies on Hamas and other groups to justify their own existence, so they're not going to do so. And unfortunately, this vicious cycle is, well, similar to what happened in Rhodesia. It's just causing a death spiral. Because Rhodesia, if you're unfamiliar, it's nowadays called Zimbabwe. When it first gained independence from the United Kingdom, or when it first declared independence, I should say, I don't believe it was ever recognized as independent. It was an apartheid state similar to South Africa, except it was even more brutal, and it had to be because white people were an even tinier slice of the population. So you had this tiny minority of the population that was trying to maintain control over a much larger swath of the population, and the way that they did that was by, you know, denying black people basic human rights, denying them education, denying them decent jobs and everything, and that pisses people off. That tends to make them mad for, you know, pretty obvious reasons. And whenever they spoke out against it or tried to rise up against it, either peacefully or not, then the Rhodesians would come in and massacre a shitload of civilians. Like, for whatever reason, far-right people like to pretend that Rhodesia was this brilliant military power, which it like didn't have a whole lot of resources, but they were run super well and did an amazing job. They didn't. They were really good at massacring civilians. That's about the fuck it. And this not only turned more and more and more of the population against them until eventually it just became this overwhelming tide, which the small white minority just couldn't stand up against, even if they were united. It prevented the white ruling minority from being united because there were moderates among them who were just disgusted by the radicalization by the radicals among them. And so, again, I feel like Israel is going down a similar path because while, again, the average Israeli is unfortunately very racist, there are tons of Israelis who are much less racist and see the horror of what's going on and speak out against it. Like, just recently, there was an 18-year-old kid who got put in the news because he is refusing to be conscripted into the IDF, and he's going to prison for that for an indefinite length of time because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, it's a very strange democracy where the military has control over what journalists are allowed to publish, and people go to jail for refusing to serve in the military, and they use the military and police to shut down peaceful protests all the time. It's a democracy. But there are Israelis who are stressing moderation and are pointing out that by squeezing harder and harder and harder and killing more and more and more people, the Israeli government is isolating itself from the world, because we're seeing foreigners in places like the United States and Europe who are being turned off from Israel and seeing them as, well, I don't want to say seeing them as monsters, but a lot of people are unfortunately going that path. And we shouldn't see average people as monsters. We shouldn't. Like, their government is awful, and an unfortunately large chunk of the population is behind that, which is how the government is able to exist and function in the first place. But average people generally are not evil. However, especially younger generations are being turned away and are being much less sympathetic towards Israel and much more sympathetic towards the Palestinians. And even if that doesn't change anything right away, as the years go on, they will become more important to politics in places like the United States, and as such, the U.S. government and them are going to be less strongly allied with the Israeli government, leaving them more and more isolated. And also, this is starting to anger Israel's neighbors, who they were starting to normalize relations with, such as Saudi Arabia. And so the country is just becoming more and more isolated, and at the same time, moderate Israelis are pointing out that, hey, we're pissing off the Palestinians more and more, so that's going to cause, various problems, up to and including terrorism. And this really can't continue forever. But the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel and the far-right politicians who work with and depend on them to stay in power, they not only refuse to stop doing what they're doing, they are amping it up more and more and more, and they're going to have to continue amping it up more and more and more because, well, unfortunately, that's what far-right politics, that's what fascism is. It demands constant escalation all the time. And so when I say Israelis are their own worst enemy, they really are. Like the Israeli far-right is cannibalizing itself. Or I shouldn't say it's cannibalizing itself, it's cannibalizing Israel. And I can't predict the future, but I do know that the less democratic countries become, the less militarily effective they become for a variety of reasons. And once Israel is no longer a military, I don't want to say superpower, because it's just too small of a country to be a true superpower, but it's way more powerful than any of its neighbors, so it's not under any real threat of invasion. But if that's gone, if the IDF ever really starts to rot away, which it's already doing, like the reason the October 7th attacks were able to happen is because a lot of people in the IDF were not really being listened to, and people in the intelligence community were not being listened to, and Netanyahu straight up took a huge chunk of soldiers that were supposed to be guarding around Gaza and sent them to the West Bank to harass Palestinians and help settlers murder them and push them off their land. So, again, far-right regimes generally are not militarily competent because they have other priorities. And once Israel loses that, it's going to be in a pretty bad spot. And exactly how bad that spot's going to be is going to depend on its relations with its neighbors. But again, the more it cracks down on Palestinians, the more it attacks people in Lebanon. The Israeli military murdered at least one journalist in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago. And that's just a thing that happened. They also murdered a bunch of women and children in a school in Gaza not that long ago. And I mean, the IDF is saying that they didn't do anything, but they're also refusing an independent investigation to occur, or they're refusing to allow an independent investigation. So do with that information what you will. They very much are losing the propaganda war here. And once you've lost the propaganda war, you've lost the actual support of not only people abroad, but they're losing support among their own people. At least I believe they're going to start doing that. And I'm not saying Israel is going to collapse the same way Rhodesia did and cease existing the way Rhodesia did. And I'm not saying the current regime is going to collapse and it'll be replaced the way South Africa did, but it's not a good situation to be in right now. And if they can't reverse their current course, then it's not going to be fun to be an Israeli in the next couple of decades.